Broadcasting from our New England studio, Solutions Review is proud to showcase PCG and Infor in the Solutions Spotlight, an inside look at enterprise technologies.
I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review, and welcome to the Solutions Spotlight featuring PCG and Infor, and focused on modernizing ERP systems for aerospace and defense. We are living in uncertain times with threats around the world, supply chain disruptions, the onslaught of generative AI, and aging enterprise systems in the aerospace and defense world. So today, we're hosting a panel of industry experts to share their strategies on navigating this rapidly changing landscape. To drive this conversation, we have invited ERP expert Kyler Cheatham. Kyler is the Chief Performance Officer of The Confluential. She's also a noted enterprise technology marketer, influencer, and podcaster. Kyler, I'm going to hand this event over to you now. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you, Doug. I'm so excited to be here today. And thank you to our amazing panelists for joining this exciting conversation. We're going to get into a lot today, talking about mission readiness, operational efficiency, national resilience, and how you really take your ERP system and look at the need for aerospace and defense requirements. So we have Alex Plitsis, who is an Army veteran and expert in defense and intelligence information operations. He shows us how technology supports modern missions and is kind of an expert on the Infor side. So thank you so much, Alex, for joining us today. And then we have Luis Avila, who is a technology expert and leads kind of large-scale ERP transformations, digital modernization efforts across government and defense, really ensuring all those tech initiatives really deliver that measurable impact, especially in change management. I heard Luis is kind of your sweet spot, so we'll talk a little bit about that today. We also have John Shorter, who is a seasoned enterprise architect. He looks at cloud transformations, IT modernizations across defense agencies, and really focuses a lot on that system integration, which is absolutely huge for the aerospace and defense industry just in general. So welcome, John. Thank you for joining us today. And of course, we have Andrew McWaters, who's Vice President of Systems at Avex Aerospace. This is a defense industry firm that specializes kind of in that airborne intelligence. And he oversees a lot of business management systems and supports the operations to really bring that to the forefront. I know we're going to talk a little bit about the project you're working on today and really dive into those details. So thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us. And last but certainly not least, we have Dan Aldridge, who most of you should know as a main thought leader in our industry. He works with the PCG team and really leads kind of delivering those high trust partnerships and those solutions to our aerospace and defense partners. So thank you so much, panelists, for joining us. If you do have any questions throughout the conversation, pop them in the comments and we will respond to them. But right now I'm going to pass it to Alex for a quick intro.
So thank you. I mean, I think, collectively as a group, we've all spoken over the past 6 to 12 months. There was a bit of uncertainty in the market in terms of the direction things were going to head due to some conflicting information that was floating. But we've seen some recent activity and statements that have sort of clarified the state of the aerospace and defense industry, particularly on the defense side when it comes to spending for the next year or so going forward, and then outward-looking projections in the years thereafter. Going back into the year, late last year, earlier this year, there were questions about the DOGE team and what they were going to cut within the Department of Defense. There were rumors floating of 8 to 10% cuts. And then it looked like that was more of a redirect of those 8 to 10% of funding towards different priorities. And so there was a bit of uncertainty related to that. And then also for acquisitions going forward, again, statements made about unmanned versus manned aircraft that was coming from Elon Musk, who's the senior advisor to the president. And so finally, we saw both Congress and the administration put into writing what it is they're actually looking for going forward. And we saw a couple things that have transpired over the last month, I think, that really provided some clarity. So first, for this year's budget, which is already in existence, Congress was seeking an extra $100 to $150 billion on top of spending in 2025 for additional items such as missile defense, for aircraft, for unmanned systems, for artificial intelligence, and some transformation activities, which would take us for the first time to over $1 trillion in defense spending in a single calendar year. And that's now in addition to the base spending. Separately from that, the White House released its discretionary spending request to Congress for FY 2026 for the following year, in which we saw an actual year beginning with a $1 trillion request to Congress. So while overall they were looking at a 23% reduction in federal spending across the board, that came with a 13% increase in defense spending. So for the defense portion of the aerospace and defense, we've seen a fair amount of clarity provided after 6 months of uncertainty. So for a lot of firms that were trying to figure out what capital projects and outlays look like and whether or not the revenue was going to be there or whether their programs would see substantive cuts, I think we're finally seeing some reassurance in the direction that the administration wants to head. And in a couple of key areas, like I mentioned. So missile defense, shipbuilding is obviously huge, not only on the Navy side, but also for commercial, for transportation, unmanned systems, as we're seeing. So that's really where the focus is, which is fantastic. And, having Andrew McWaters here to speak, a little bit later on about AVEX, their company, that some of the amazing work that they've done in the space has just been incredible to watch over the last couple of years. I mean, truly just a transformational institution, and the impact they're having worldwide is kind of, it's hard to minimize in words, no matter how you try. I mean, they're really doing amazing stuff. So separately from that, on the aerospace side, we've seen an increase in commercial orders. Boeing just settled a dispute they had with the government, which is good. So that'll avoid sort of looks like litigation on that side. And they've just seen a huge increase in orders that have come in now after the president's swing through the Middle East. I think the largest that they've ever seen in one entity. And that's just one manufacturer. We're seeing that across the board for aerospace manufacturers. So the orders are going in. Again, we're seeing more reliance on composites, fuel efficiency as we start to move into those requirements getting into 2030 and 2050. So across the board, large defense increases, large increase on the aerospace side. And where we're seeing significant substantive growth are in some of the micro verticals. And while they may not make up a huge percentage of the overall spend in the entire industry, the growth within those micro verticals is quite large in comparison year over year to, say, other portions of it. So space systems being another one of them. So whether that's satellites or rocket delivery systems to deliver payloads into space, whether that be commercial or for dual use or for government use. We're seeing double-digit growth in those areas as well. So industry is looking quite healthy across the board. Feel quite fortunate. I think colleagues here will, discuss a little bit of the tariffs. I mean, there is some margin absorption taking place as there are some disruptions to some of the raw materials, semiconductors, metals, et cetera. But across the broad swath of the industry, it's largely being dealt with. I mean, most folks are seeing supply chain disruptions and delays is really what it's tantamount to at this point. We'll see what's held in the long term, and I think some colleagues here will have some more comments on that topic. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, lots of great changes going on, but lots of transformation. And I want to go over to you, Luis, to kind of talk through what that looks like. We have a lot of regulations that go along with these transformations. We have kind of the issues that Alex touched on in the marketplace. How can businesses within this industry kind of plan for that need for regulation and compliance?
Thank you, Kyler. And Alex, thank you for that overview. I hope everyone was taking notes. I mean, Alex just brings so much great information about what's happening. He has his ear on the ground. So thank you for that. And Kyler, in terms of your question, I think a fundamental ability to succeed in this highly regulated and complex environment is understanding the dynamics of the evolving landscape. And for that, I want to bring up the conversation to 5 key critical elements that are affecting aerospace and defense leaders and their ambitions to transform their businesses. One is macroeconomic trends. The other one is trade and tariffs, which are reshaping defense aerospace supply chains, shifts in U.S. defense acquisition policy, mergers and acquisitions, and technology and innovation. Of course, we don't have 3 hours to go through all that, so I'll try to compress that in about 5 to 6 minutes. So buckle up, because there's going to be a lot of information. So why don't we dive right into macroeconomic trends? We also, the height of the inflation during the COVID era with about 8% or so of inflation, and then it started to ease up during the last couple of months, the last couple of years. along the global supply chain pressure index, which measures the pressure of U.S. companies, including aerospace and defense leaders, to source raw materials, subcomponents, and components. However, we're now starting to see a divergence between the two, where inflation still kept slightly at bay, around 2% or so, but the global supply chain pressure index is starting to go up. And that's because of these tariffs. I know some of my other colleagues here, John, will touch more about tariffs in a few minutes, but in trade. But that is basically what's making that go up. Now, the other concept that we need to keep in mind in terms of this topic is the budget and funding erosion. There's modest defense budget growth that is barely counteracting inflation. Although, as Alex mentioned a few minutes ago, there's a lot of push to increase that budget. So we hope that takes place. And what I can tell my clients and what I hear from business leaders is that in order to mitigate and strategize to counteract this environment is using price adjustments clause, longer term supplier agreements, and efficiency improvements, especially leveraging technology to manage economic pressures. And this whole environment is probably going to lead to some industry consolidation. So we need to be very aware of that trend. Now, going to trade and tariffs, and again, John's going to get more into detail with tariffs, but I do want everyone to have a view of what's been happening in the last 30 years or so. Pre-pandemic levels, we all believed in hyper-globalization. There was low inflation, low interest rates. It was all about sourcing from the cheapest place possible, right? And then right before the pandemic, we got into this friendshoring, nearshoring, where we started bringing those supply chains closer to home because of the counterfeit electronic parts risk, because of non-conforming items. That's where we started seeing higher inflation, higher interest rates. Now, we're getting into a protectionist economy, a stagflationary period with selective liquidity and high inflation. Now, the key here, and nobody has a crystal ball, is trying to understand or trying to predict what the Federal Reserve is going to do about this. They have a difficult choice. On one hand, they can raise interest rates, which would fight inflation but worsen recession, or lower interest rates, which would stimulate growth but worsen inflation. So for business leaders to understand what can happen, prepares them with the right strategy to overcome that particular challenge. Now, shifts in U.S. defense acquisition policy. This is a pendulum we have seen go back and forth for from the beginning of time. In the 1990s, after the Cold War, DoD largely adhered to cost reimbursable contracting. But going into the 2000s, around 2005, 2007, frustration with cost overruns, especially with the F-35 program, it promoted or led to Congress mandating a preference for fixed price contracts. Now, we go back to the pendulum, 2010s, the GAO published a study that says the fixed price does not guarantee lower cost. So now we go back to cost plus. And now we're finding ourselves with that pendulum going back to fixed price because of the Department of Government Efficiency and the ability that we need right now to be more agile in our contracting process. So what does that mean? We are hoping to see less regulation, faster contracts, more agility, and that will be an opportunity for small and middle market companies because they find themselves with perhaps not winning that contract because they didn't abide by certain requirements, right? They didn't have a battalion of people, to use an army word, a battalion of people that know the FAR, the DFARS, 2,000 pages of the FAR. So this trend is going to level off the playing field, and we think it is going to allow the government to focus more on value rather, who knows by memory, 2,000 pages of the federal acquisition regulation. So that is that. In terms of mergers and acquisitions, and I know I'm telling you a lot of different areas so you can strategize how your company is going to overcome all these different angles from the market. So in terms of mergers and acquisition, private equity's role has been to dominate buyouts since 2022. We saw with Apollo Global buying Barnes Group in 2024. In terms of strategic buyers, which are companies, we're seeing more of a strategic vertical integration. We see Boeing's reacquisition of Spirit AeroSystems and L3Harris purchase of Aerojet Rocketdyne. This whole trade and tariffs environment is pushing strategic buyers to rethink their ability to source subcomponents and components and lead them to those vertical integration strategies. Last but not least, technology and innovation. I'm not going to talk about Gen AI because I'm sure there are smarter people in this call that can talk about AI agents and how it works with enterprise applications. But one thing I can tell you from a regulatory perspective is that finally CMMC is here to stay. We have all heard the different requirements about CMMC, and if there's one thing you can take away from this is that we have finally reached standardization of what are the requirements for CMMC, and now we have a clear path of what we need to do in the next 2 to 3 years to comply with these rules. If you're part of the 70% of the defense industrial base that falls under CMMC level 2, the requirements are going to start sometime around the end of 2025. So this will be the right time, if you haven't started to do so, to do assessment and line up your plan of actions and milestones. Thank you, Kyler, for the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Luis, for all of that great information. And so going over to you, John, you're the architect here, right? You really kind of plug in all these integrations and understand how the system flows. So tell us a little bit about how you take these regulations that are coming into the marketplace, these standardizations, and actually implement them as far as system requirements.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I see, I spent 16 years as the CIO of engineering and supply chain for General Electric. I saw this hundreds and hundreds of times, these kind of challenges. 10 years as a senior vice president of transformation at both Oracle and Infor. And I will tell you, I've seen this over and over and over again, whether it is a 2001 or 2008, where you had massive disruption to supply chains because of recession and depression in some cases, or COVID, where you had a massive disruption to supply chain for these kinds of issues. The challenge is very different now. Now there is capital that is going to be invested, but there are regulations you have to follow. And if you do not follow them, you are no longer a viable supplier. So what I do see is when companies look at how they're going to accomplish these challenges, right? It will come down to your ERP system. Believe it or not, that does matter in this case. It's not just a financial bookshelf. It actually is very, very important here. Let me explain why. When I went through this, I've seen this hundreds of times where companies didn't have a good process for an agile supply chain, to use Luis's words, right? To be able to pivot very quickly when you had to change. As if a trade embargo comes in against a country, pick a country, I won't say which, you have to stop taking parts from that country. Period. It's not optional, right? Significant fines and some jail time in some cases. So in order to accomplish that, you have to very, very quickly pivot your supply chain to an alternative source. And so right now, most companies are out looking for alternate sources for supply because they do see things coming that are going to cause disruption in their supply chain, almost as bad as what we saw with the pandemic, but in a different root cause, right? The root cause now will be regulatory requirements, massive tariffs being applied, causing it to be not financially sustainable, or embargoes. Embargoes will be coming in some cases. So you'll have to be very quick and able to pivot. Now, how do you do that? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to be able to plan. You have to have a plan for how you accomplish fulfillment, right, at the best possible margin, right? Because that's what's going to hurt if you don't do this well, while doing a change of your supply chain. Second, you have to be able to pivot suppliers very quickly. What does that mean? That means your engineering systems have to be up to speed so that you can actually qualify a supplier, train a supplier on how to build the product, certify the supplier, because you'll have to do that in many cases, and then be able to look at the quality, the performance management, and the on-time delivery, and the financial aspects of that supplier. You do that through a supplier collaboration portal. These are elements that Infor has a great product, Oracle has a product, and many people have products that do this, but you have to have it. It's not optional. And throughout that process, it must be compliant with CMMC level 2. It must be compliant with the CUI requirements, IL2 today, IL4 in the future. It must be compliant with all the FedRAMP requirements, right? Those are not optional, as you know. And I think what you'll see is there are going to be some suppliers. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of aerospace and defense companies in the last 10 years. And I will tell you, some companies are taking the ostrich approach, right? They're putting their head in the sand. And that will end up with them not being a viable supplier in the industry because these requirements will not go away. They will be absolutely doubled down on, if nothing else. So in order to stay in front of that, you must be ready to pivot your supply chain. You must be looking at your future growth opportunities and how you're going to fulfill with the new supply chain. When you do an acquisition or merger, I did many of those in my General Electric days, you have to be able to understand what the new acquisitions capabilities are as well. Are you going to vertically integrate? Are you going to pivot to other supply sources? Things such as that. These are all things you're going to need capability to do that. You can't do that on paper anymore. The days of doing it on spreadsheets are long gone. It's far too complex and there's far too many technical requirements that have to be provided to suppliers. You have to have the ability to pivot. So I would say the biggest thing right now is that companies need to become more, we use the word nimble, right? But become more capable in their supply chain systems, their engineering systems, and their financial systems so they can anticipate these kinds of activities. So yeah, it sounds like a sales pitch, I know, but it's real. It's exactly where we are, right? This is the reality of where you are. You have to be able to handle this now because it is far too complex to handle with a spreadsheet today. So that's sort of how I would think about it, kind of from my perspective.
Yeah, I think that's such an amazing overview and perspective. And what I love about this conversation is, Alex, Luis, and John all gave us kind of all of these different theoretical things, but now we have Dan and Andrew to go through an actual case study and kind of tactically talk about how you implement all of these different initiatives to have your system support you in this transformative phase in the industry. So with that, Andrew, I'm going to pass it to you to kind of go over what you've done in conjunction with Infor and the PCG team to kind of achieve all these great results.
Sure. Thank you very much. I don't know how I got this spot, but following up these three guys is going to be a challenge, so I'm going to do my best. So I'm VP of business systems at Aerospace or AVEX Aerospace. And, we went through a process of looking at ERP vendors. We ultimately settled on, Infor, Ellen, CloudSuite, as the one that we were going to implement. So I'll take you through that journey, and we'll talk about some of the things that we did well, some challenges, and then, obviously the things that the others mentioned. So there were two kind of key roles. Obviously my role was, representing AVEX. So we have Eve, NATO that was representing PCG. So I'll cover her side a little bit, but we'll talk about, more about AVEX, and how we achieved the go live that we did. So little background on myself, 20 years of ERP implementation. I've done a few NetSuites, one SAP, obviously some Infor. Now, dating myself, I started on the bond support center. So, those of you who've been around the bond world or the Infor world, spent some time on the support center. So those of you who've been around, you may have called, may have been on the front end or the back end of one of those calls where you needed some support. So, just broader IT as I, branched out in my career, you get at things like cybersecurity, blocking things like ESPNs, or you can't track your scores and stuff. So, but soft skills, I love the problem solving, getting into the complexity and simplifying it of a problem. So, using technology to do that, and finding a path forward. So again, about me, I served in the Marine Corps way back, from Michigan. Yes, I'm a Lions fan, so you can dig on me if you want to. But I've lived all over, so I won't talk about Eve's kind of, the PCG side. So I'll just leave this up for a few minutes, and then you can see her skill set. Again, she was she was key program manager from PCG. So her and I, obviously work very, very closely together on this project. And, I'll get into a little bit more about the project as we go. So about AVEX, we have, sites all over the globe. You can see it there, 25 countries, 5 continents. We've got 2 kind of main delivery areas. We'll talk about Tampa, Florida, which has the loitering munitions and the UAS, UAVs, as the site that went live on LN. Currently implementing the California site as well. So the aircraft modification, that's up there in Temecula, California. So again, they're in flight on LN. And the project we'll talk about today is the Tampa, Florida site. Obviously, we're going site to site. So maybe I'll be doing another one of these in a year with a couple more sites. But that's a little bit about AVEX. We'll talk a little bit more about our end-to-end solution. So remote sensing, the aircraft modification, that's the current site that's in flight. They're in process. So we kicked off the project a few weeks ago. Tactical systems is effectively the one that's, the one that we'll talk about today. So they're live on LN, and we'll talk about some of the modules and things that we implemented in tactical, and some of the things that, are really helping us achieve that design challenge that everybody's having with getting different suppliers and making sure where everybody's on the same page. So we'll talk a little bit about that during the presentation. So more just solutions, data provisionings, QRC solutions. So that's kind of the background of AVEX. So we'll just keep moving along here. So why, right? We obviously, I think our biggest challenge was product design. I think some of the leaders talked about this already, right? Inventory, procurement, product design, right? Those were our biggest challenges, is getting real-time information, applying it to the UAS, and then making those changes become a reality at the manufacturing floor. So streamlining that, just making sure everybody understands, what's happening, when the change is going to occur, why it's occurring. So we needed a system, right? We needed IT automation to do that. So, again, we went through a selection process. I won't go into that, but ultimately ended up with CloudSuite, the A&D, the Gov Cloud. So again, let's continue on here. So timeline is very important. I won't go into all the phases of the project, but we really kicked off the project in June of 2024. Why that's important? Because it was very short in timeline. So go live was December, 31st for all intents and purposes. So we had to have, a lot of speed, a lot of things that, as you work through a project, you're like, is this a requirement or a must-have or a should-have? So Moscow's played a very important piece of what we were able to get implemented. So we used that as our guide to make sure we didn't leave anything behind. Those must-haves, we got evaluated very, very, very to the nth degree to make sure, hey, is this really a must-have because of the short timeline? So we did a very good job. PCG, the team at PCG, the consultants, really streamlined that to meet the requirement of the go live. We weren't going to move the go live. Ultimately, January 6th was the first day in operation. But for all intents and purposes, we wanted to have everything done by kind of the holidays kicking off. So it was very important for us to get, through the, these phases that you see here, inception and elaboration. But besides that, AVEX was also going through other transformations. One, we decided to go with the different HRIS, HR, human resource management, however way you call it. So during this process, we selected UKG as the HRIS system. So these needed to be, these systems needed to be, they needed to go live all at the same time. the reason for that is we needed a two-way integration between big projects and things like our time and attendance system, WFM, which sits inside UKG. Additionally, at that point, we knew we needed a new expense management system. So, I guess it was pile on IT. So we threw in Concur expense management. We're already using the travel piece, so it just made sense for us to go with Concur expense. So again, another two-way integration, right? We needed to get expenses into Concur, but then get them over to the projects so that we could effectively bill and maintain, obviously customer and cost. So, so all these things needed to go live. On top of that, we needed a way to do reporting. So we went with PCG Data Lake Sync for the Gov Cloud, and stood up our own data lake in Azure. So all this obviously, presented a big challenge, not just to the PCG team, but myself internally, getting these things lined up, understanding the integration process of how I was going to get data over to WFM for people to be able to charge time, but then also be able to get things over to Concur for them to be able to charge sundry expense, in some cases material costs, and having that all flow back through, project costs. So TP for, large projects. So if you've been in the industry and you use LN, TP, the TP module is big projects within inside of LN. So what does that mean for, Eve and I? Well, it meant solving some of these key business challenges. So I'd say for us, it's very disjointed. So we had a PDM, we use SolidWorks. Again, that was separate. We had a separate inventory management system from our finance system. So all that said, I don't have to explain that to you. When your kind of your PLM, your PDM is separate, getting rapid, modifications and revs through to the manufacturing floor posed a significant challenge for us. So, when I walked out on the floor, I saw a lot of red line drawings. So, that was one key that was like, this is not working the way it is. So too many red line drawings, too many silos in the process. So receiving inventory was done separate, then the financial transactions. So really just, eliminating those silos, just manual processes, right? So, that was everywhere. There was no barcoding. There was no, hand scanners. There was no terminals for people to pull up drawings. So getting that automation in the hands of people that could use it, just basic stock receiving functions were all done inside the system. There were no, mobile devices, no kiosks for them to be able to walk up to. So then obviously the financial reconciliation between the inventory system and the finance system was just a big challenge. And trying to couple all that, you had quality and compliance sitting there going, hey, Andrew, we need to get quality in the mix. We need to have things that, go through receiving inspections, in an automated system. So again, without, an integrated system, that was almost impossible to do. So a lot of paper, a lot of manual recording of transactions. So, with that said, we had a very aggressive timeline. You saw that we had 4 systems that had to essentially go live at once. So even I made up this joke that, our challenge, so the PCG challenge and the AVEX challenge was to land a 747 on a canoe. So I'm using some AI graphics stuff. I was able to make this slide. But that's about as, easy as I can explain it. Very aggressive timeline, a lot of manual processes. Again, deciding on which ones meant more to the organization was really my job at saying, okay, I'm going to be able to get you there, but we gotta line up the Moscow, we gotta line up the must-haves, the things we have to accomplish, right away so that the go live is successful. So, but yeah, you can see myself and Eve up there in the cockpit. I don't have my little pointer, but she's kind of short too, so I had to put her on some phone books or whatever so she could see out the window. So, but, we'll talk a little bit about the successes and challenges next. So, what worked well? Obviously, I'm big in collaboration, right? I think that's part of change management, collaboration, right? You got to establish good collaboration. I think systems like LN, and other large ERP systems, they really force you to do that approach. When you have disjointed systems, you can work in a silo and do a lot of, finger pointing, like that wasn't my job, that was somebody else's job. When you come up on systems like, Infor LN, it forces the collaboration. So, obviously we entrusted the PCG implementation framework. It's tried and true. It's been in the industry a while. So, and then, obviously we relied on the consultants and then some internal resources. So a couple of us, in the IT side had LN experience. So I think that always helps, having a little bit of that. The ERP you select, having some internal experience really helps. You don't always have to rely on the consultants for everything. So we had a seasoned consulting team, but we also had, our internal team had a few seasoned people as well. Not all, which I'll point out in a few slides later. So, we started the data migration early, right? That's key, right? You're coming from disjointed systems. The majority of the time, if your PDM is in a separate system and your inventory is in another system, getting things like the golden list, right? I call it the golden list because you need a very, very, stout part number list out of the gate. You need that early. So I coined the phrase, hey, let's get that golden list together so that we can drive what we want to put into the system. Because typically, once you have that, you're going to be able to decide, hey, of these items, what vendors do I need? What customers do I need? So it will drive other areas of your data migration. So we really focused on, getting the golden list, getting the part number list. That brought over what bombs we needed, what customers we needed, what suppliers we needed. And of course, it's a trickle-down effect off of that. So stakeholders, obviously the CRPs were crucial. So conference room pilots 1 and 2, those are really where you put, that master data to work. So, getting that early data migration planning for us was key. That getting that in front of, the conference room pilots, maybe not a large scale. We didn't have a lot of time. So, but we did small scale samples of what that data was, and we used our own data. So that really helped, tremendously. We just, I think, most of the products were tried and true. So we didn't really have, any issues there. So again, that's really what worked well for us. And again, to highlight any one of these to say, hey, if I had to pick one, it would definitely be the proactive data migration. Nothing can lead to project extension timelines more than our master data is not ready. We don't have sign off on our master data. So getting that started early was a key for us. So challenges, I don't want to, beat a dead horse here, but the project timeline was extremely short. It's, you throw in the holidays, you're talking 5 months, 4.5 months, you're really narrowing it down. And throwing in all the other systems at the same time, really helped even shorten that project timeline because, well, a lot of us were focused on LN. There were other people from my staff focused on, the other implementations. So it really was, a very, very short timeline. So, our internal project team, we set up BPOs, business process owners and SMEs. As we got through down to some of those BPOs and SMEs, they weren't very, they haven't had a lot of exposure to large scale ERP systems. So most of them were used to siloed systems. So again, some of that was, again, they were green to the large ERP systems. But, we worked through that. I think in some cases we had some internal turnover on the work stream. So, nothing hurts a project more than getting halfway through an implementation in one of the BPOs or a key SME lease, it really has an effect on the project, right? Because you got to bring the new folks in, get them trained up, especially timing wise. It's probably not so adverse late in the project, but we had some early in the project. I would say 2 months in, and you're trying to recover, some of that ground. It's very difficult. So, we had some poor interdepartmental communication, and then again, I won't go back to the master data, but it's very difficult to pull from all the systems and get it aligned. Some of the tools were just cloud-based. You couldn't really, get direct access to the data. So lots of challenges there. I would say, look, for the short timeline, we pegged the term happy path. So, we set up the CRPs in a way that, they were, especially the first one is very scripted. So people came in, sat down at the computer, the script was there to tell them what to do. So again, that first CRP was very, very happy path. I'd say the second conference room pilot, later in early December, we had a little bit more, what if scenarios in there. What if this didn't happen or that didn't happen? But again, it was, very, very happy path related. So, no change management strategy. I would say, some of that internally, relied on myself, right? We were trying to implement 3 systems. We didn't really do a good job of explaining how those systems were going to interact. So, we talked about it earlier in the presentation that, that interaction or that change management is very important, right? But seeing how systems were going to interact, like what information was going to flow over to WFM, what information was going to flow back. Because of the shortened timeline, we didn't really have a good way to cover that. But we should have spent more time on that. So that's where I think the change management, seeing end-to-end processes versus the siloed process, this is what you're going to see in WFM. Then going back to LN and then saying, okay, after WFM does its thing, our time and attendance, this is what you're going to see on the project. We showed those in silos, but we should have showed an end-to-end. So, obviously factory track was a big one for us. We've got kiosks on the floor. We're pulling up drawings. No more red line PDFs floating around, trying to figure out if that has the latest revision on it. But we're we implemented PLM, and I think that was one of the strongest areas where we focused, right? Good, revision control, good bond management, all the way through to the factory floor, all the way through the work order. We implemented things like serialization. So, that was big for us so that we knew internally LN was tracking that serial number for us off the work order. So just more, I think the cross-functional communication for me as the internal project manager, the biggest thing is seeing people in the hallway working together and saying, hey, let's look at the software or let's try to find another way to do this. Maybe it wasn't optimized coming out of the go live, but having that internal communication saying, hey, I think there's a better way to do this with LN. Let's talk about this or let's talk about that. Sometimes re-engaging myself or re-engaging the consultants, it proved pivotal, especially on the short timeline. You knew you were going to have some should-haves that got left behind in the Moscow, but going back through the optimization phase, picking those things back up and getting them in the system. So we just kept realizing more and more and more as we got into that optimization phase. So traceability, obviously serialization just provided us a huge traceability. Just, the pegging from here's a requirement, here's a delivery schedule on the project, putting that in, running MRP and seeing it peg all the way through, seeing project pegged inventory, seeing labels print out that, put on the receipts with project pegging information on it. So you can walk up to a box and go, okay, this is project pegged for this project or that project. So there's just more and more that we can go through. But yeah, and then we use DEMS. DEMS were big for us. So, DEMS allow us to create process flows for people to work through their day-to-day activities. So, that was huge for us and getting those dialed in, especially for people that aren't, big on, using big systems. So it really helped us. So yeah, those are some of the key benefits. In conclusion, yeah, we definitely, we got our Tampa site live, PLM, planning, procurement, all the major modules are implemented. The data lakes, we're on a path to move to Power BI, but we're using SQL Server Reporting Studio. Looking ahead for AVEX, obviously we keep rolling it out at some of the other sites, but we are currently in our project in Temecula, California. So that's kind of where we're geared up towards. But again, I still think we're in the optimization phase. So we continue to roll out new things. We had a recent, business case for lock control. We're implementing that. So all the way through the manufacturing operation. So again, we're continuing to optimize the Tampa while we shift gears to get the Temecula site, again, up on Infor, Allen Cloud Space. So I'll kind of leave this last slide up so you can take down some points of contact. But I appreciate the audience today listening to the AVEX journey and story. It's not yet told completely, but, definitely thank you for listening today. And if you have any, questions, there's our contact information.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. This was such a great overview of what a transformation really entails from a detailed perspective, especially when it's kind of location by location. Each location has a different culture, has a different set of needs. I think this is just an awesome overview that showcases how you essentially implement those business systems in a very complex environment. So before we get into our QA, I invite our audience to put any questions they might have for Andrew and team in the comments, and we will go back in and answer those as a part of the live conversation. But I kind of want to do just a quick round robin of questions for our panelists today to kind of wrap it up. Going over to you, Luis, I know you have an expertise in change management specifically. I would say us engineers in aerospace and defense are not known for our change management qualities. And a lot of times that can be something that is almost an afterthought when it comes to these types of implementations. But it can be something, as Andrew mentioned, that is a huge consideration in making them successful. So can you talk a little bit about how you help these types of companies or your company in general look at change management as a high priority in these transformation projects?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Kyler. I think to any enterprise application or business transformation project, there are three pillars that are very important for that project to succeed, to realize the software promise. One is program management office, the other one is business process improvement and compliance, and the third one, as you mentioned, is organizational change management. We advise and we ask our, ask business leaders to ask from their providers, what does training and adoption mean to you? Because you may find out there that training and adoption just means, hey, we have a huge library of technical manuals. We'll provide them to you and go ahead, read them and figure out how to use the enterprise application. That's not training and adoption. Training and adoption is making sure that there's an alignment of communication with strategy and why the transformation is happening. How are individuals in the organization going to benefit from this business transformation? And what are the capabilities that will make their day-to-day better, easier? We'll automate those things. I generally share a story, not a story, but an analogy of what training and adoption should be. We have all been in a very fancy restaurant with expensive chandeliers, silverware. We go to the restroom to wash our hands. And as we're washing our hands, We try to use the soap dispenser and there's no soap. Instead, we find a $1 bottle of soap that was bought maybe at the CVS around the corner, and that's what we use. And why? Because the employees that were supposed to change that soap were not trained to do it. So now we've wasted all this money and capital on putting all these expensive dispensers that are not working because they're empty. So when you think about how that translates to the organization, is spending millions of dollars, a lot of investment in enterprise transformation, and all of a sudden individuals go back to manual processes, go back to Excel spreadsheets. You got to make sure that the implementation sticks and people embrace change.
Absolutely. So well said. And that is so critical. And, the manufacturer of that soap dispenser involved in that conversation if there's a critical error. So I love that analogy. Such a good one. Going over to you, John, I'm curious when it comes to the example here in case study that Andrew laid out. You highlighted a lot of challenges that are facing the industry when it comes to regulations, supply chain disruption. From your vantage point, what would be maybe the top one or two most pressing issues that aerospace and defense or A&D manufacturers today need to take into consideration when looking at their technology?
Absolutely. So first is are you agile? Are you nimble? Are you able to take technical data, provide it to new suppliers, new vertically integrated manufacturing facilities, a variety of things? Are you capable, right? Or are you doing it on spreadsheets? Are you doing it on green screens? Things that just don't have the flexibility and the capability that you need in today's world, right? The regulations have been designed for the modern software landscape, right? They haven't been designed for the old way of doing things. Part of the motivation behind the regulations, yes, cybersecurity is a big part. Let's be clear. Having run many, many factories in Asia, I can tell you that was a huge challenge. But I would say that the bigger issue is they're trying to get companies to modernize. And if you look across all the industries, I worked across several industries at both Oracle and Infor, and I will tell you, aerospace and defense has lagged everyone else significantly. And it's because they are relatively fixed in terms of processes and procedures because it's very, very steeped in defense industry processes, which is normal. That makes sense. Now that is changing. And so the ability to pivot your operation, it becomes a critical element of your capability. If you do not have a modern system to do that with, you will struggle. It will be extremely difficult. I've worked with a lot of companies where they were trying to do that with legacy processes and spreadsheets and things like that, audits that had a room full of boxes of papers, right? Things like that. It's not a viable solution anymore. And so I think one of the things that I do see that is a tremendous opportunity is start fixing it, right? Hey, don't solve it all in one day. AVEX did it in 6 months. Unbelievable, right? I did over 400 PLM implementations. Not one was less than a year. Let's be clear. But I would tell you, the important thing to remember is start fixing the problem, right? Because if you're starting to solve the problem, you will actually start seeing the opportunities open up. So that's definitely the most important thing I would say. Rather than a couple, the most important thing is evaluate and then start solving the problem, and do not wait.
Absolutely. Well said. Definitely something that, Andrew, you kind of laid out. And going to you, as a lifelong Lions fan, you are no stranger to adversity, right?
Yeah.
No.
Not at all. Nope.
Which makes you oddly qualified for these types of, ERP implementations.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, as kind of John talked about, the need for that alignment across the organization of all kind of marching towards one goal. You talked about there was lots of siloed processes, as John and Luis mentioned. How did you kind of set that enterprise level mindset of, hey, we're doing this and this is something that's going to be positive moving forward? How difficult was that for you to navigate?
Yeah, it was very early on, I think early because I came in from the outside. So I needed leadership, obviously, to set that. So I relied on, my leadership to start setting that tone. I carried the tone down through the organization. That's saying, hey, this is the reason we're doing this is because, as John pointed out, you've got to make the change now or we could just keep sitting around and talking about it. But we needed an enterprise system. We needed to be more mobile in our PLM, PDM type of information. So not only internally did we know how to manufacture, but externally we could get those drawings to the right people to help us source parts, or even go to a different source that is more, FedRAMP capable as we ramp up our, compliance. We're also ramping up everybody around us. So I think it's twofold, but I definitely, coming in from the outside, you have to rely on leadership. They have to set the tone. My job is to carry that tone through the organization, saying, hey, this is why we're doing it. And then it propagates back that leadership. Again, if people try to circumvent myself, when it goes up to the top, it has to propagate right back down. This is why we're doing it. This is what we're doing. I think sometimes communicating what we're doing, you don't do as a well of a job. So I think highlighting that case versus saying, hey, we bought an ERP. This is when it goes live. That's one thing. But I think the education on, as well on why we're doing it. I think over 20 years, 30 years, I don't see that getting done very well. So, but again, leadership sets the tone. I facilitate that down.
Yeah, that trickle down effect is so critical. And it's a journey, not a destination, right? So you might get that alignment, but when we're 2 years down the road, everyone's like, why are we doing this again? Yeah. So it's so critical, to make sure that why continues to be kind of the project manifesto going forward. So switching gears just a little bit, I want to end with a kind of more of a technical question for you, Dan. There's been talks about PLM, we talked a little bit about the importance of MES, going into AI, all of these kind of emerging technologies. Can you talk about, from your experience, how you're seeing some of these examples in the marketplace, and talking about specifically that design and production to life cycle type of support and visibility that Andrew talked about that was so important in this case study?
Yeah. Great question. So first of all, the trend is to have these industry solutions verticalized. So it makes it very specific to the regulation requirements and the functionality requirements of the industry, of the A&D industry. And Andrew mentioned that's on the GovCloud too, which is one of the stipulations there. But I think for you're also seeing a convergence of these different kinds of formerly siloed applications, like PLM, for instance. PLM is a technology that's been around for a while, but often was interfaced. The system that Andrew put in actually has embedded PLM, which is very important, so that it just improves the speed and the ability to incorporate projects that are very important in the aerospace and defense industry. Any project-based industry, it's very important to incorporate that in, because actually that project number becomes part of the item number or the part number in cases where it's specifically linked. So that integration, or having it embedded in the ERP, or very easily interfaced to the ERP. So Andrew mentioned SolidWorks, for instance. SolidWorks is a very common PDM type package, engineering type package that has an interface. So it has an interface to PLM in the system, so that you kind of look at all the pieces that he had going. Andrew, God bless you, man. All of this stuff in 6 months, that's insane. Like John was saying, PLM alone could be more than a year. But he has UKG for the time management. He has Concur, which is actually SAP, but he's integrating it with the ERP system. Just an insane amount of things that are actually in isolation are their own full projects. So he was able to manage that, and he had to get way out in front of it, right, Andrew? I mean, when you hit the ground, you're doing data migration, you're doing business process evaluation, intelligence mining, all of those, taking advantage of all those tools, and then saying, oh, UKG's got to be bolted on. Okay, I'm going to have to start that in the engage phase of the project, right? So these are kind of the technology trends to your point, or to your question, Kyler, that I'm seeing that are making the ability to adapt, to be nimble, like John said, to do projects much more quickly, because these things can actually be done concurrently and with an end date of 6 months, which is insane, in my opinion. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I was actually Andrew's consultant back in the bond days, and I'm sure I called bond support, help desk, whatever. So we've known each other for a long time, but it's really impressive what he did. And I think it's part technology, but it's part, things that he would have liked to get to, but he couldn't in 6 months, like change management, like the PMO would have been great. But, 6 months, Jesus,
Yeah, I mean, beyond impressive, certainly. I'm sure Jan is proud of both of you. So
that's right, our mentor.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. But yes, I think that's such a good answer. And I love what you said, Dan, about kind of fitting the technology to the client, not siloing, this goes only in this package, this goes only in this package, right? Being that technology first and customer centric approach of saying, what do you need? And how do we show up as a partner to give that to you? So as we close out today, I just want to do a quick reminder to our audience about where you're from and what you do. So we're going to do kind of just a quick round robin. We already heard from the AVIX team. So we'll go and we'll start with you, Luis.
Thank you, Kyler, and thanks for the opportunity here. And thank you to our audience for joining us in this great discussion. BDO is the 5th largest professional services, global professional services firm in over 160 countries and $15 billion in revenue. As a global business advisor, we deliver strategic insights and hands-on implementation support through a comprehensive array of management consulting and advisory services, as well as tax and assurance services. At the end of the day, we help business leaders respond to challenges, uncover new opportunities, and adapt to a constantly changing business environment. Thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Luis. We'll head over to you, John.
Hey, John Shorter. So I am an independent consultant supporting the Providence Consulting Group. I've retired software executive, spent 16 years as the CIO of General Electric for the engineering and supply chain functions, 10 years at Oracle and Infor, where I was the Senior Vice President of Customer Transformation for both companies, focusing on cloud implementations. My role at PCG, I'm really supporting them in their large-scale transformations and really whatever strategic support they need, but also any activity they need tactically with customers. I have over 1,000 transformations in my career, so I've got a feel for it.
Wow, that's amazing. Very, very impressive. And Dan, take us home.
Sure. So Dan Aldrich, I'm a sort of retired ERP consultant, I guess you would say, Director of Marketing at PCG. We're partners with Infor and with NetSuite. And I run the marketing operations.
Wonderful. And you do a great job of it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such an amazing conversation. Of course, we could go for hours in asking all of these great panelists our questions. If you do have follow-up questions, just go ahead and pop them in the comments and we'll go through and tag the panelists. I also highly recommend you follow all of them on LinkedIn, as they're often giving weekly or daily thought leadership around aerospace and defense that is very, very tactical and can, work in a lot of different environments, even if you're not in A&D. But thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your journey. And thank you to the PCG team and Infor for really facilitating this transformation case study that we were able to kind of dive into today. So with that, we will turn it back over to the Solutions Review team. Thank you to the panelists, thank you to the audience, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Kyler.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kyler.
Well, there you have it, another solution in our spotlight. We want to thank PCG and Infor, Kyler, and the entire panel for that presentation, and we appreciate your attendance as well. Until next time, I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review. Thanks for watching.
If your business would like to be featured in a future event, contact us today.